screen and introduce yourself if you can.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm trying to do two things at once. I'm Ann Garwood. I'm supervisor of the Wetlands, Lakes, and Streams unit in EGLE Water Resources Division. So our unit provides program direction, program development, and technical support for administration of Michigan's Wetlands, Lakes, and Streams programs. This includes a lot of support in the regulatory programs, but it also does include some non-regulatory program activities like wetland monitoring, processing conservation easements, things like that. But I was a permit reviewer, field staff in Warren District Office for several years at the beginning of my career. Then I was a coastal wetland monitoring specialist for several years, and now I am the supervisor of the unit, just to give you guys a little background about me. And today we are going to be talking about evaluating feasible and prudent alternatives as part of the permit process for getting permits under Part 303 Wetlands Protection and Part 301 Inland Lakes and Streams. So, probably everyone's familiar, but Michigan does have a large variety of water resources that we protect, and the state of Michigan and the Water Resources Division and EGLE in particular protects and monitors 4 Great Lakes, 3,288 miles of Great Lakes shoreline, 11,000 inland lakes, 36,000 miles of river, 6.5 million acres of wetlands, and groundwater resources. A little background about Michigan's 404 program and our regulations that we're going to be talking about today. In 1972, Michigan's Inland Lakes and Streams Act was first passed. This act regulates activities on inland lakes and streams. In 1977, the Federal Clean Water Act was amended to allow state administration of the Section 404 program. And in 1979, Michigan's Wetland Protection Act was passed. This law was passed with the intention of assuming the Section 404 program. In 1983, Michigan and EPA signed an MOA, which was later revised in 2011. This MOA provides approval of assumption of the Section 404 program. Later in 1984, Michigan and the Army Corps of Engineers signed an MOA, which designates the navigable waters over which the Section 404 authority is retained by the federal agencies. And ultimately in 1984, Michigan fully assumed administration of the regulatory program under Section 404 for most waters. Through this program, we maintain federal consistency with the Clean Water Act, Section 404. Michigan does this through administration of Part 303, Wetlands Protection, and Part 301, Inland Lakes and Streams, and the administrative rules associated with those. The requirements within these statutes and rules are very similar and reflect the requirements of the Clean Water Act coming from the federal regulations, Title 40 of the Protection of Environment Code of Federal Regulations, the 404B1 guidelines, specification of disposal sites for dredge of fill material, Part 230 compensatory mitigation rule, the Section 404 program definitions and permit exemptions, and the Section 404 state program regulations. In Michigan, we have similar permitting structure. Michigan's 404 permits can be general permits, minor projects, or public notice level projects. General permit and minor project categories are issued for up to 5 years total, and they are updated and revised at a minimum of every 5 years. This is similar to the Army Corps of Engineers nationwide permits, which are updated every 5 years, regional general permits specific to the district, which are updated also on a periodic basis, and their individual permits. Probably most of that was review for most of you, but today we're going to be specifically focusing on the portion of our process in the regulatory program that looks at alternatives analysis and feasible and prudent alternatives to projects. Specifically, we're going to be talking about why it's required and what it is. Before I jump into the alternatives analysis portion of this really deeply, though, I want to remind everyone that the alternatives analysis is just one piece of the decision-making process that WRD must go through on every permit application. There are a large variety of permit review criteria that we have to consider when making decisions, including things like unacceptable impacts to aquatic resources, feasible and prudent alternatives, public interest, wetland benefits, the functions and values provided by that wetland and what will be impacted. We have to consider the cumulative impacts within the watershed. We have to consider public trust, riparian rights, and water quality standards, among other things. So I'm going to start at the beginning with where this concept of alternatives analysis comes from. In the Clean Water Act, Section 404 permitting criteria in the 404B1 guidelines, it specifically states that permits can be issued only if the project will not result in unacceptable adverse effects on the aquatic ecosystem, and that no discharge of dredged or fill material shall be permitted if there's a practicable alternative to the proposed discharge, which would have less adverse impact on the aquatic ecosystem. In the administrative rules of Part 301, Inland Lakes and Streams, this concept is also reflected. It states that in each application for a permit, all existing and potential adverse environmental effects shall be determined, and the department shall not issue a permit unless the department determines both of the following. A, that the adverse impacts to the public trust, riparian rights, and the environment will be minimal, and B, that a feasible and prudent alternative is not available. In Part 303, Wetlands Protection in the statute, in Section 303.11.2, it states that in determining whether the activity is in the public interest, the benefit which reasonably may be expected to accrue from the proposal shall be balanced against the reasonable, foreseeable detriments of the activity. The decision shall reflect the national and state concern for the protection of natural resources from pollution, impairment, and destruction. And then it lists the following general criteria that shall be considered. There are several listed in this section, but the one we're talking about today is item B, which states that the availability of feasible and prudent alternative locations and methods to accomplish the expected benefits from the activity must be considered. Later on in the same section, 303.11, item number 4 states that a permit shall not be issued unless it is shown that an unacceptable disruption will not result to the aquatic resources. In determining whether a disruption to the aquatic resources is unacceptable, the criteria set forth in section 303.02 and subsection 2 shall be considered. That's really referencing the functions and values provided by wetlands. And a permit shall not be issued unless the applicant also shows either of the following: that A, the proposed activity is primarily dependent upon being located in the wetland, or B, that a feasible and prudent alternative does not exist. Then again, in the administrative rules of Part 303, Wetlands Protection, rule number 2A, Section 2 states that as required by subsection 303.11, item number 4 of the Act, a permit applicant shall bear the burden of demonstrating that an unacceptable disruption to aquatic resources will not occur as a result of the proposed activity, and either of the following: that A, the proposed activity is primarily dependent upon being located in the wetland, or B, there are no feasible and prudent alternatives to the proposed activity. And I'm going to pause on this one just for a second, because this is the section that makes it clear that the applicant must provide that demonstration with their application, which is why it's a required item on the joint permit application, and which is why In screening of the applications we receive at the state level, we're often asking applicants to provide additional information related to the alternatives analysis and the feasible and prudent alternatives that were considered for the project. So let's start getting into it. What actually is a feasible and prudent alternative? An alternative is feasible and prudent if both of the following provisions apply. A, the alternative is available and capable of being done after taking into consideration cost, existing technology, and logistics. And B, the alternative would have less adverse impact on aquatic resources. A feasible and prudent alternative may include any or all of the following: use of a location other than the proposed location, a different configuration, size, and method that will accomplish the basic project purpose. What kind of information can be provided in an alternatives analysis, and what should be considered when looking at alternatives to the project that you're planning? Well, one of the things is alternative construction technologies. There's an example of 3 photos on the screen right now. It's just a simplified version of this example. When thinking about alternative construction technologies, ultimately a project might be a stream crossing project, right? You're trying to construct some method of crossing the stream. And certainly a traditional culvert is one option for accomplishing that. But there are many cases where the culvert may have significant adverse impacts on the stream quality and function or associated wetlands. And there may be a feasible and prudent alternative that could minimize those impacts, such as the middle photo shows an elliptical culvert. Or a bottomless culvert. And this is an example of something that may have less adverse impact on the aquatic resources while accomplishing the same project purpose. And finally, another alternative technology that could be used for such a project would be a clear span bridge, which is similar to what is shown in the third picture on this screen. This is certainly a simplified example of the kind of alternative technologies that could be considered in alternatives analysis, but it's a good example of what we're talking about when we say consideration of alternative construction technologies. All of the slides I'm going to be sharing here with these types of examples are going to have this language at the very bottom that says the list of factors listed in here is not exhaustive, and no particular factor will necessarily be dispositive in any given case. Another kind of information that can be provided in an alternatives analysis are alternative project layout and design. So this is one that we encounter a lot, particularly with larger projects, things like housing developments, commercial developments, industrial developments. Oftentimes we have a lot of back and forth with applicants talking about alternative project layout and design. Some of the main things that come up with this are looking at the landscape features, right? So looking at the project site, it may have a stream, it may have wetlands on it, and trying to, the best of your ability, design the project site around those features, avoiding and minimizing to the extent possible the impacts to the wetlands, lakes, and streams on the site. Some of the associated infrastructure with these kinds of projects are often the subject of consideration. For example, parking lots. With many commercial and industrial development projects, parking lots can take up a very large footprint of the proposed project and therefore often result in significant amounts of impact to these protected resources. But there are alternative project layouts and designs that could minimize parking areas, such as eliminating islands and ancillary features within parking lots, reducing the number of parking spaces, or parking structures, elevated parking structures. They can provide the same number of parking spaces or even more while providing a significantly smaller footprint. Obviously, parking structures don't work for every kind of project, but on those projects where they do, they should be considered, and they can be ways to minimize impacts to these resources. Similarly with housing developments or things like that, eliminating portions of the project, smaller, pieces of lots that are proposed in wetlands, for example, are often alternative layouts that should be considered. And we're going to go through some examples at the end of the presentation here that get into some of these in more detail. Another type of category that is mentioned in consideration of alternatives analysis that can be provided include local land use regulations and infrastructure. It can be important to provide this information as part of the considerations put into looking at alternatives to minimize impacts to these resources. Certainly, there are certain infrastructure needs for different kinds of projects. There can be zoning restrictions on different kinds of projects. There can be local land use regulations that require setbacks or different uses of the land that would limit certain alternatives or that may provide additional options for alternatives. These can be provided in an analysis as well. And pertinent environmental and resource issues. Sometimes there's contamination issues that should be included in consideration of alternatives or that may reduce the number of alternatives. There can be consideration of things like landfills or waste management that need to be considered. There can be cleanup projects that have different kinds of options for alternatives or limitations on the alternative designs and methods that they can use. So this kind of information is also relevant to an alternatives analysis. What about off-site alternatives? So it's important to note that an area not presently owned by the permit applicant, but that could reasonably be obtained, utilized, expanded, or managed in order to fulfill the basic purpose of the proposed activity is considered a feasible and prudent alternative location. Now, with different kinds of projects, there's a different geographic scope of alternatives, depending on the specific project purpose and the needs of the project. An applicant must provide justification for the geographic scope that was considered, and it must be reasonable. So you can't limit the scope of your alternatives analysis basically to the site that you're looking at, or the site right next door, something like that. It's got to be a reasonable area that was considered. And some projects can go further out than other projects, depending on the operations that are going to be underway at that project. So it's also important to know that alternatives that do not include certain components of a proposed project can be considered feasible and prudent. In fact, the rules state that an alternative may be considered feasible and prudent, even if it does not accommodate components of a proposed activity that are incidental to or are severable from the basic purpose of the proposed activity. And there are two pictures on the screen that show an example of a residential lot development, a single house that's developed. And in one of the photos near the bottom, there's a house with a driveway. I think there's an attached garage. It's kind of hard to tell in that photo. There's a mowed lawn area, and there's a pool and a patio, a swimming pool and a patio, all included on the lot. But in the northern or the upper picture, you can see that these lots back up to a stream with a forested riparian corridor associated with it. And so a feasible and prudent alternative on those was to build the house with the driveway and the attached garage, but without the large mowed lawn area and the swimming pool. Those were considered severable from the basic purpose of the proposed activity, which was to build the house. Thinking of the same concept of components of a project that are severable from the basic project activity. In the commercial context, we see this a lot as well. These large white buildings that are in these two photos are large shopping centers I don't know if it's a, Meijer or a Walmart or whatever, but they're a large store like that. And similarly, they both have large parking lots associated with them. And I think most of us know that oftentimes there are outlet buildings on these developments that are for, fast food restaurants or things like that. And you can see in the northern photo, that's the example, is that there are 4 small outlet buildings shown on the same parcel with the large shopping center and the parking lot. And this may be the proposed project as it comes in. But the lower photo shows that a feasible and prudent alternative would be development of that same shopping center and parking area without the outlet buildings. They can be considered severable from the basic project purpose, but the project, that would be a feasible and prudent alternative. So what about cost? Cost is always discussed in these kinds of considerations. And the rules do state that an alternative may be considered feasible and prudent even if it entails higher costs or reduced profit. However, the department shall consider the reasonableness of the higher costs or reduced profit in making its determination. We do this through consideration of the information provided by the applicant that supports the claims of where the cost becomes, too significant. So we do have to have applicants who are providing cost information provide some supporting information to demonstrate at what point an alternative has too high of an increased cost or too low of reduced profits for the project to be feasible anymore. Let's start talking a little bit about when alternatives analysis needs to happen and when it needs to be considered. And I say when, but really what we're going to be talking about is that it kind of follows the entire process. It should start early on in the planning phase, and it will continue typically all the way through the permit decision phase. But it does sort of change at certain points. First and foremost, it's important to know that every project does need a feasible and prudent alternatives analysis. Large projects, small projects, it's required on all Part 301 and 303 applications. An alternatives analysis must be provided with the application initially. It's required for completeness. It's a required item on the joint permit application. And much of the time, applicants are going to attach additional documentation to the JPA rather than answer all of it just in the field that's in the digital JPA. So the alternatives analysis can be and should be commensurate with the size of the project. The more substantial the proposed impacts of the project, then the more substantial the alternatives analysis, which is really the effort to minimize impacts, must be. For large projects, a basic rule of thumb for large projects proposing large impacts, a typical alternatives analysis should include at least 2 to 3 off-site alternatives that were considered and at least 2 to 3 on-site alternative configurations or methods. And this can be, more or less depending on how significant the proposed impacts are with a certain project. Again, all applicants must provide an alternatives analysis. Specifically, they need to avoid and minimize impacts to water resources, and these considerations should be all throughout the planning phases of the project. Ultimately, an applicant should be thinking about alternatives to their proposed project that would minimize impacts to the protected resources at the time of property purchase, and again, at the time of permit application. And we'll be talking about it during the application review and during the time of permit decision. And if there's an appeal process on our ultimate decision, whether or not a permit is issued or not, if going into an appeal process, consideration of alternatives to minimize impacts will be a part of the conversation. And that's what I meant when I said it really follows throughout the entire process. But in administration of these regulations, WRD does have a responsibility to sort of follow the order of operations as it relates to the statute. And what I mean by that is, first, a project must be shown to have been designed to avoid impacts to the protected resources to the extent possible, and then to minimize those impacts to the extent possible. And only after avoidance and minimization have been achieved do we really consider mitigation for those impacts. This comes directly from the rules under Part 303, which specifically state the department shall consider mitigation only after all of the following conditions are met. And you can see that they do follow that order if you read it. Wetland impacts are otherwise permissible under sections 30302 and 30311 of the Act, but also that no feasible and prudent alternative to avoid wetland impacts exists, and an applicant has used all practical means to minimize impacts to wetlands. This may include the permanent protection of wetlands on the site not directly impacted by the proposed activity. But this is part of minimization of the impacts and is not considered compensatory mitigation. Now, the statute does list several special considerations related to alternatives analysis in the statute, and I'll read some of them here. Many of these are when alternatives are considered and places the burden of proof on the department rather than the applicant. For example, number 5 states that locations not owned by applicants are not considered as feasible and prudent when less than 2 acres of fill or dredge is proposed for a single family home, farm building, or small business facility expansion, and that for activities that do not meet a general permit category. Number 6 says proposed structures alternatives shall be evaluated on the footprint on the resource and not the overall square footage. Number 7, choice and extent of the activity within a proposed structure is not to be considered. And number 8 identifies when costs can be considered a limiting factor, primarily if it's unreasonably cost prohibitive. So we're going to talk a little bit about project purpose because it directly relates to alternatives considerations. The Wetlands Protection Rule 2A, number 4, states that a permit applicant shall completely define the purpose for which the permit is sought, including all associated activities. An applicant shall not so narrowly define the purpose as to limit a complete analysis of whether an activity is primarily dependent upon being located in the wetland and of feasible and prudent alternatives. The department shall independently evaluate and determine if the project purpose has been appropriately and adequately defined by the applicant and shall process the application based on that determination. So when thinking about how this relates to alternatives, you have to be thinking about whether or not an alternative is the least damaging alternative, least damaging to the resources that are being protected. It must be based on the project purpose. So an alternative may be considered feasible and prudent, even if it doesn't accommodate certain components of a proposed activity that are incidental to or severable from the basic project purpose. Going back to the concept of building the house without the swimming pool, or building the shopping center without the outlot buildings. Those are still feasible and prudent alternatives to the project. The project purpose couldn't have been so narrowly defined as to prevent those considerations. And again, it is commensurate with the size of the project. The more substantial the proposed impacts, then the more substantial the analysis and the effort to minimize impacts must be. And this, when we're talking about impacts, we're not just talking about the size of the impacts being small or large, but also the types of impacts. For example, rare wetlands or high quality wetlands versus lower quality wetlands. You know, if there are alternatives that would impact a lower quality wetland than a higher quality wetland. Similarly, local watershed issues such as flooding. There are certain areas of the state that experience significant flooding problems. And in those areas, an impact that may not be considered as significant in another area would be considered more significant. And cumulative loss of wetlands that have occurred within highly impacted watersheds. In those areas where there has been significant cumulative wetland loss, there will be additional requirements to conduct further and further alternatives analysis and find ways to avoid and minimize impacts to those remaining resources. But it's also important to keep in mind that when we're asking for alternatives that avoid and minimize impacts, it's not all or nothing. So every little bit of reduced impact counts. Some common ways that applicants minimize impacts include what I like to call scooching, or reducing the size, the angles, the dimensions of the project components like buildings, roads, parking lots, stormwater, other structures. Can you scooch things around to, avoid a little bit more wetland here or a little bit more stream relocation there? Parking lots, as I mentioned, and I will well be mentioning again, parking is one of the big things that often comes up in looking at alternatives to minimize impacts. Eliminating parking islands, reducing the number of spaces, and elevated parking structures are often going to be considerations. And stormwater impacts. Low impact alternatives such as green roofs, rain gardens, bioswales, pervious pavement, changing the shape or design of the stormwater structures that are proposed with a project can further reduce the footprint of the project impacts or the type of degradation that can result from that project. Many of you know that we do have what we call a 3-tiered permitting system for wetlands, lakes, and streams: general permits, minor projects, and public notice projects. It's important to keep in mind that essentially the general permits and the minor project categories represent the best management practices. So therefore, if you're proposing a project that doesn't meet an MP or a GP, oftentimes we will be asking why the minor project or the general permit category criteria wouldn't be sufficient. Ultimately, because those represent the alternatives that are considered feasible and prudent to larger impacts for those types of projects. We're going to talk through a series of examples at this time. All of these examples are generally based on real situations that we have encountered, but they are not using actual permit plans or permit projects to show on the screen, because every case is a little bit unique and different. So these are all based on real scenarios, but many of them are sort of graphic representations. The first one is probably the most basic of the examples we'll be talking about. This diagram shows a proposed property boundary for a single family home. The project is to construct a single family home that includes a house, a garage, and some curtilage fill. As you can see, there's a stream and wetland on the property, bisecting the property. So initially, the proposed project might look something like this, with a driveway crossing and a culvert across the stream, some wetland fill, and construction of the house and the garage, sort of near the back and the center of the property. One alternative that should be considered as an alternative configuration is crossing the stream at a different location and moving the house and the garage to the back and reducing the amount of curtilage fill around the house, the area that would become the yard and stuff. So you can see on this screen, we've entirely avoided the wetland impacts and reduced the amount of culvert crossing, reduced the length of the culvert crossing to cross the stream at the narrowest location and the narrowest wetland place where there essentially was no wetland. But another alternative could be to move the house and the garage towards the front of the building, which avoids wetland impacts and stream impacts entirely. It's important to note that the size of the house and the garage remains the same on all three of these examples. The size of the fill associated with the house and the garage has been reduced in these examples, and obviously the length of the driveway has reduced. Now, in this case, in the real situation that was similar to this, I believe that there was a variance that was needed for the setback requirement at the local level, but it was obtained. We're going to talk through an example here of a residential development project. So there was a proposed residential development project that had a similar layout to this, with a stream that essentially bisected the site. For the purposes of this example, there's not wetland associated with this. It's just a stream. So the initial proposal included construction of 48 lots with 1 culvert crossing and 1 800-foot stream enclosure, resulting in a project layout something like this. But one of the feasible and prudent alternatives that was considered would be reducing the number of lots to 44 buildable lots, with 3 smaller culvert crossings totaling only 120 feet of total stream enclosure. As you can see here, they did eliminate some of the crossroads in this configuration and reduced the number of lots. But ultimately, what was permitted out here ended up being something more similar to this. They significantly reconfigured the design of the roads for this project, resulting in a couple cul-de-sacs. And ultimately, they still got 44 lots constructed, with only 2 culvert crossings totaling only 80 feet of stream enclosure. So thinking a little bit more about residential development design, it's also a feasible way to look at this, considering open space and conservation design and some of the techniques associated with that, such as clustering, the use of conservation easements and deed restrictions, and plan unit developments. Traditionally, the design would have been similar to a grid layout, similar to sort of what we showed in the last example, with fairly little regard for natural and special features. Under conservation design principles, you would consider mapping the resources first before designing the project. Things like on this example, lakeshore, streams, wetlands, steep slopes, forest areas, scenic views, and rural views. Then identify areas to retain trees, wetlands and lakes, scenic views and access, and natural feature setbacks. Then select potential home sites. In this example, all the homes would have lake views and all residents would have equal access to the shoreline. With an ultimate layout, something like this. This includes single loaded roads, which are better for privacy and views, and trails, which encourage pedestrian and recreational friendly development. With the lot lines and community amenities added to it, ultimately it would look something like this. In this example, it would add up to preservation of natural features, private lots and common areas, an increased sense of community and social opportunities, and shoreline use concentrated into a single dock area, which could often result in higher property values. In this example, I'm going to pivot to an inland lake situation, a sort of a single riparian owner on an inland lake example. In this example project, a riparian owner owned lake frontage where they were proposing to dredge essentially all of the shallow water area in front of their property and construct a 30-foot long dock. One alternative that would need to be considered would be proposing a smaller navigational access channel for navigating in and out of the dock and constructing the dock. In this case, only 900 square feet of dredge. But ultimately, an even less impacting alternative was available, which was simply constructing a longer dock, a proposed 60-foot dock, which would include no dredging necessary and would allow for navigational access and exercise of their riparian rights. Here I'll talk through a commercial and industrial development example. This particular example is based on a commercial development permit that was reviewed, but it's similar to some other industrial ones as well. So as you can see on this diagram, there was some wetland and a stream in the northern portion of the property. There was a large building and large parking lot and a stormwater pond that were proposed on the property in a configuration similar to this. It included a stream location and wetland fill and a stormwater pond with discharge. One alternative configuration that was considered resulted in the same size building and parking lot, but they were turned and configured slightly differently and reconfigured the pond layout as well. This resulted in a shorter stream enclosure, reduced wetland fill, but it did include stormwater pond and discharge with direct impacts to the wetland. Another alternative that was considered reduced the overall building size and parking lot size. It had fully eliminated the stream enclosure and eliminated the wetland fill associated with the project. It did still include the stormwater pond and discharge, which were reconfigured to avoid the wetland, but they still needed a permit for the project for the stormwater pond and discharge. However, reducing the overall building size and the parking lot was not conducive to the overall project purpose. So another alternative was considered. In this case, it was a commercial development, and they were able to reshape and reconfigure the building layout to a different size and shape while maintaining the same square footage. So the building in this example, in this final option, is the same square footage as the original building that was proposed, but it is outside of all wetland and stream impacts. Then they were able to utilize a parking structure instead of a parking lot, which significantly reduced the footprint of the parking impacts, but allowed them to maintain the same number of parking spaces. This layout eliminated the stream enclosure, eliminated the wetland fill, and even the stormwater pond was reshaped and resized to avoid wetland impacts, so that all of the wetland impacts and stream impacts were eliminated other than the stormwater discharge. This example here is one that's getting at that issue of sometimes it's not just the overall size, small or large, of the impacts proposed, but the local considerations. So this was from a residential development, a commercial development project where the proposed wetland impacts were actually relatively small. However, there were significant flooding problems in this watershed, and this watershed had experienced significant wetland loss. Therefore, we considered some of these impacts to be unacceptable, and alternatives needed to be considered to avoid and minimize the wetland impacts even further. So it's hard to tell, but I did circle it. On the top, you can see there were originally 10 buildings proposed. One of those buildings was eliminated. In this red circle area, building number 1 was ultimately eliminated, so that in the end, only 9 buildings were constructed to further avoid impacts to the wetland that was providing some flood storage. Although the wetland quality was somewhat low and the overall impacts were somewhat small, the local consideration of wetland loss and flooding problems did make this a feasible and prudent alternative. So to sort of summarize what I've talked through a lot of here today, it's important to consider some of the basic things when you're working on an alternatives analysis and project planning. For example, what other site plan iterations are considered, including project configuration and size, other methods or technologies to accomplish the same things, buffers that can be provided around some of those resources to prevent and address potential secondary impacts, what additional properties were considered or could be considered, and what's the justification for that geographic extent of those offsite alternatives. Always remembering what is the ultimate project purpose and what pieces of that are severable from the project. Keeping in mind whether or not an economic analysis should be provided to justify why some alternatives are not considered feasible or prudent. Where that line of what's unreasonable is, it is partly on the applicant to provide that information and justification for that. And essentially what we're saying is, where's the breaking point on the project if you can or cannot implement certain alternatives. And it always has to be based on the scope and context of the specific project. So that is the last of my actual slides for today's presentation. I'm guessing that there will probably be some questions. Let me move my screen around.
Great, thank you, Ann. We do have a few questions. I think you can see the Q&A too, but I think there's a question about temporary impacts associated with single-family homes, and do they always have them, and do they require a permit?
So I don't know about always. I would say that much of the time there are temporary impacts associated with single-family home construction. I think this is probably in reference to the example where the home was right up near the edge of the wetland boundary. And we do sometimes have applications where the home may not be being placed in the wetland, but the temporary impacts associated with constructing around it, or ultimately with just the necessary kind of curtilage and fill slope around the house, would have either direct or secondary impacts to the wetland. And those do need to be considered in the application. There needs to be a demonstration of what those impacts are and whether or not they're permanent or temporary, and sort of why that would be. Yeah.
Perfect. And how they would be minimized, I assume.
Exactly. Yes.
A question about dredging. I think this is more for just the permit application, but does the department, they take into account area, which is what you show, but do they also take into account volume?
So we do need both. We do have to consider both. Typically the area is more the focus, but ultimately minimizing the overall impacts, minimizing the amount of dredge, both area and volume, is something that we are looking for, minimizing it to achieve the project purpose, if that's navigation or dockage or whatever it is.
Perfect. And maybe, I don't know if you said it or not, but one question is, why are planned unit developments preferred? Are they considered least impactful? Did you indicate that?
So I didn't mean to imply necessarily that they're always preferred. I would say when they're designed, it's more clear what the alternatives are, alternative layout configurations and layouts are that could prevent direct and secondary impacts to the wetlands, lakes, and streams resources. And so planning them ahead through a PUD type of process does allow for consideration of alternatives that would avoid and minimize those impacts to the greatest extent possible. This is not always necessarily less impactful, but it often allows us to consider the impacts on the bigger scale. And so it's not necessarily always the preference, but it is an easier way of reviewing the projects and sort of designing the projects and considering ways to avoid and minimize impacts during the design process.
Perfect. Okay. So when looking at additional properties, are you saying that people need to potentially obtain additional property or easements for other properties? And what if they try that and the answer is no? Does that need to be documented?
Yeah, so I guess the discussion about additional properties or offsite properties comes up in a couple of different contexts. Oftentimes what we're asking for is the applicant to look and see if there's another property for the whole project that would be appropriate. Another property where they could build this project that would result in less impacts to wetlands, lakes, and streams. But there are other times when what we're talking about is, so for example, sometimes we have a project that's proposed on a single piece of property that has a lot of wetland on it. And the adjacent property is also for sale and has less wetland on it. It may not be big enough by itself, but could they acquire that property and reconfigure the site design to reduce the amount of wetland impacts overall, those kinds of things. So that could be one scenario that's talked about. Other times, I think this person might be talking about for mitigation, because they mention obtaining an easement. So the consideration of when to obtain another piece of property to provide preservation as mitigation is sort of a different context for consideration of other properties. Today's presentation was really focused on alternatives to avoid and minimize the impacts from a project, and really was not focused on mitigation. But that is another context of when we're looking at obtaining or acquiring land or placing conservation easements on it. In project design and in the application, if you did consider other properties, but you weren't able to acquire them, other properties that would have resulted in less wetland or stream or lake impact, but you weren't able to acquire them, yes, definitely include documentation of that with the application. It does demonstrate the effort put into avoiding and minimizing impacts, and it does demonstrate the limitations on what you were able to obtain.
Okay. So a question, again, I think it's just maybe too general and not every site, but does EGLE require conservation easements on remaining wetland for single family residential residential structures?
It is a pretty general question. It depends on the project, I would say. For large developments, it's very common for us to get conservation easements over remaining wetlands to prevent secondary impacts and cumulative loss in the watershed. On smaller projects, single family projects, it is really dependent upon the specifics of that project. So sometimes it would be appropriate and other times maybe not. I can't quite answer that.
Okay, depends on the impacts and maybe the
Yes,
quality
yeah.
of the wetland and things like that. Okay. There is a question about buffer zones. Can you speak to the buffer zones between wetlands and upland developments?
Sure. I think developments that are able to be designed in a way that incorporates buffers around wetlands, they can, make the case that their project will have less secondary impacts to those wetlands, and those wetlands will continue to provide functions, maybe better than other wetlands that are constructed right up to the boundary adjacent. So I do think that's an important consideration in designing projects and should be incorporated whenever possible. But it's not, at the state level, our regulatory authority lies at the wetland boundary. And so we can't necessarily require that in and of itself. I think that there are times when we can tell that a project would inevitably have secondary impacts on a wetland, and we would be asking for those secondary impacts to be quantified and mitigated for, but other times where that's not going to be in play. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I think it did. I think it's, you prefer buffers. The legal authority stops at really the wetland delineation boundary. Okay, so as part of going through the feasible and prudent alternatives, if an applicant is unable to get variances from setbacks or authorization for alternative road or access routes, is that sufficient to show that the alternative location or route is not feasible and prudent? I think I'm not sure if it seems that's specific, but I think you need to know what else is going on.
Well, I would say it does probably depend on that specific project, but sometimes that would be sufficient. I've said repeatedly that the alternatives considerations are commensurate with the project. So, larger scope and scale of impacts would require more effort than smaller, and, impacts in areas where there's been significant cumulative loss or to particularly high quality or rare wetlands, would have a higher bar. But ultimately, if we've asked about a scenario of accessing through another piece of property and they weren't able to get a variance or get an easement or something, that might be sufficient for us to accept that alternative is not feasible and prudent. Yeah.
So include it in their permit application.
Yep.
That information.
Yep.
Okay. So this is, I think, a pretty good question. So if they're applying for what they believe minimal impact, the least impacting alternative, that's where they've started. Do they have to go through documenting larger impacts?
So yes, is the short answer. In order to demonstrate that your project is the least impacting alternative, you would have to demonstrate that you considered other layouts and they didn't have less impact, right? Like they ultimately had more impact. I do think that applicants and consultants would benefit from, practicing looking at it from maybe our regulatory side, right? So if we get this initial layout, if you guys have been designing it for months or years even, and you're fully convinced that this is the least amount of impact that can be proposed, obviously we would be looking at it for the first time and we would be brainstorming ideas. Could you tilt it over here? Could you put a parking structure? And could you do this? To the extent that you're able to put that in the alternatives analysis that you provide with the application initially, that would be beneficial. Even if it feels like you've been, already doing that for several months or a year before an application comes in, just documenting all the effort that was put in initially is really important.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, they a lot of times, obviously, the applicant's very familiar and have been working on this project for a long time. You guys are seeing it for the first time.
Right.
Makes sense. So someone's talking about project scope in terms of who makes the final decision on the project scope, or I think in your guys' terminology, project purpose. And what if the applicant does not agree with EGLE's decision on the project scope or purpose? What's the process for disagreeing, I guess?
So, I do think that there would be a dialogue. So much of the time there is a dialogue about what the ultimate project purpose is. I have seen directly that it's better to have that dialogue earlier in the process than later in the process. So to the extent possible, including in an application justification for what the applicant believes is the project purpose and what pieces of the project are not severable and why, what that justification is beneficial. Ultimately, the 303 rule that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, it makes it clear that the applicant's responsible for proposing it and that the department will consider whether or not and determine whether or not it's acceptable. So that is one of our responsibilities. But like I said, I think there are times, so I think it's important to recognize that there are times when even if the department determines that something is severable from the basic project purpose, that may not mean it's a desirable project for the applicant, right? So the applicant may say, I'm no longer interested in doing the project if it doesn't come with the swimming pool or whatever. And ultimately, I think when we come to that situation, the applicant does have some decisions to make. Do they want to find a different property where maybe it's better suited to constructing all of the pieces that they want? Do they want to, get a denial and try to fight us through the court system? Do they want to continue the dialogue and sort of provide more demonstration and more justification for why they believe that shouldn't be considered severable. Ultimately, it is a difficult thing when that happens, but the responsibility per the rules does lie with the department to determine whether or not the project purpose has been appropriately defined.
Okay. I'm getting a few tougher questions that
Were those the softballs?
Yeah, those were. Those were. I guess I'll go back to the one just to make sure it's clarified that when they were talking about adjacent properties and easements, they were talking about potentially acquiring easements through adjacent properties. And that is something.
For like road access?
Yeah, maybe? Yeah.
I do think that sometimes that is a consideration that we ask applicants to explore.
Yeah, okay. I'm not sure if there's a clear answer to this, but does stormwater discharge typically require a Part 303 permit if no direct wetland impact? I assume they mean by
it depends
on
whether or not the stormwater is being pre-treated and to what treatment level, and whether or not the volume that is being proposed is anticipated to affect the wetlands. So I think that there's always details, right? So it depends on the specific project, but ultimately, if the volume or the lack of treatment is going to impact the wetland, then we would regulate it.
So maybe the answer to that question is, yeah, typically it probably requires some level of review.
Right.
Okay. And this is a webinar itself, I think, but I'll ask it because of who's asking it. But so how does EGLE characterize the public interest in private development relative to impacts to wetland functions?
Oh, I do think that is a whole nother webinar.
Yeah.
I think you're right. There's a lot of criteria. There's entire sections in statute and rule about how we have to consider public interest, all the things that go into that. And then there is the practicality of balancing all the different things that are listed in statute and rule, along with sort of the benefits provided by the project versus the benefits provided by the wetlands and things. I do kind of think that we're not going to be able to answer that very well right here, because that would be another 30 slides probably. And I do think it is very project specific. So.
And potentially related to legislative findings in Part 303 regarding.
Right, that section
function.
of statute references them directly. Yep.
Okay. I guess maybe if you could go a little further, someone's questioning the term. We talked a bit about buffers. I think you were somewhat clear that buffers are not necessarily regulated, except there may be secondary impacts that impact the wetland. They're wondering about statute or policy related to buffers and secondary impacts.
Right. So the statute does require that we consider the impacts of a project on the wetland functions provided, right? So the functions of flood storage and stormwater or sediment retention and nutrient processing, pollution treatment, all those functions that are listed in the statute that are provided by wetlands. And so obviously a direct fill of a portion of a wetland is going to eliminate those functions from that portion. But oftentimes there are projects that will result in continued degradation or alteration of the hydrology, the vegetation, or the functions of the remaining wetland resources that are inevitable from being, sometimes it's because that area will now be completely fragmented and the hydrology will be lost, and it will continue to degrade and provide less and less functions. The statute requires that we consider those impacts and account for those impacts as well. It also considers, the feasibility of alternatives that would avoid and minimize those. So we do have to be talking about the reality of secondary impacts when looking at alternative project layout and design. And it does also come up, when we're talking about mitigation, if there has been avoidance and minimization to the extent possible, mitigating for some of that lost function. Michigan does have a no net loss policy of wetland quantity and quality. And we do need to consider the quality and function provided by wetlands to the people of the state that results after these projects.
Great. Okay, I think this one's a little tough, but a big issue that I've been hearing a lot about is what about undefined end users? There's been a lot of, is that, how does that impact you? So
sure. So that,
how does that, is that in statute or policy?
Obviously it's not listed in statute specifically, but that is part of the project purpose. So if the project purpose is not completely and fully defined, then you can't do a complete and full analysis of alternatives. So if you don't, for example, if you don't have an end user for a project, how would you know if the building could be shaped differently? Or how would you know how many parking spaces are going to be needed? Or how would you know, that it couldn't be a smaller building or smaller size? That's ultimately the problem with end users, is that without an end user defined, the project purpose and the alternatives considered are arbitrary. They're not based on a real demonstrated need.
Okay. And I'm not really familiar with this, but somebody says in general, in minor permit categories, cutting in forested wetlands must not result in change of use of the forested wetland. Does department have specific guidelines they follow to determine what is a change in use? I assume they mean no longer silvicultural land or something like that. Change in use is your thoughts?
So part 303 does include use of a wetland as a regulated activity in Michigan, and permanent conversion of a wetland from a forested wetland to another type of wetland and maintained. So where that cutting is repeated or done in a way that prevents the area from restoring to a forested wetland again, is considered a use of a wetland. And it is a regulated activity, and it is something that we do quite regularly. It's not just in general and minor project categories, but it is cited in some of those. It really has to do with the purpose of that conversion and whether or not it's permanent or temporary, and whether or not it can be avoided and minimized. For example, it comes up a lot in utility corridor projects. Utility corridors may need to convert an area of forested wetland to another type of wetland, emergent or scrub shrub, and that impact, that use of that area for the purposes of a utility corridor is regulated as a use. I guess I'm thinking that's kind of where this person is going.
Yeah, I think you must be. I was a little confused too, but I think you nailed it, because silviculture or forestry to some level is exempt,
right?
But you can't change that. Just like agriculture, you can't take a farmed wetland or a wetland that's part of forestry and do something different with it. It's
right.
exempt for those activities, but that doesn't remove it from being wetland. But I think you nailed it with, it must be utility related. Okay, I think you answered this, but maybe you could just go over it real quick. When are alternative layout drawings required versus just text writing? I think you actually gave a little guidance on that.
So for larger scale in projects, and I guess we haven't just defined like a cutoff exactly, but for relatively small projects, GPs and MPs and other relatively small proposed impacts, we may not require full layout designs to be provided as part of the alternatives. But for larger scale projects, certainly, red files, for example, those level of projects and others that would have significant impacts proposed to wetlands, lakes, or streams, we may require at least conceptual drawings to show alternative layouts and configurations that were considered as part of the project. We would rarely be requiring them all to be, like fully engineered, but more conceptual.
Yeah, and we got a few questions on that regarding the cost of making those additional plans. I mean, I think that's how you're getting away from that is it's for larger projects and they may
It's for
have to
larger
have,
projects with significant impacts proposed. Yeah.
and they don't need
And
full
that's why
engineering.
we have that rule of thumb I mentioned, that sort of for those scale of projects, if they could be provided, you know, I don't think we've said it for very long, but that 2 to 3 on-site and 2 to 3 off-site alternatives, if those were provided initially with the application, for large scale projects, that's going to be really helpful to the applicants and to our staff.
Okay. So the last question is in regards to, I think it's, and we got a couple of these, so I'm going to bring it up. I'm not sure if you're prepared to answer this or how you guys are handling this, but it's 30311 section 5 in regards to the regards to the 2 acres, not more than 2 acres of wetland, if not a property not presently owned by applicant, which could reasonably be obtained, utilized, expanded, managed in order to fulfill the basic purpose. How, do you know what that means? What's your guys' interpretation of that section?
That's probably a whole nother webinar too. That is a complicated section. So there are specific situations listed in that section for when impacts proposed less than 2 acres. Essentially, the burden lies on the department to determine whether or not there's an offsite alternative, and rather than the applicant. So it's not that there couldn't be an alternative location, but it's that the burden isn't on the applicant for that. So it is a little bit complicated, and it's specific to just those scenarios listed. The rest of the time, the burden is on the applicant to demonstrate that.
Perfect. Well, we really appreciate it. And we had almost 140 attendees at one time. And so we appreciate everybody attending. Keep an eye out on for the Michigan Wetland Association website for new webinars. Again, we are having them regularly now, and you can sign up for that, become a member, and check out our trainings. Trainings are typically listed in February of each year for the year. So check those out. Thanks again, Ann, and thank you for everybody who attended.
Thank you.